these kinds of arguments have been going on for the entire history of journalism education in the United States. They're still going on, and in the last generation or so, they've appeared in Europe. Some universities have started programs in media studies or communications theory, but not actually training people to be journalists. The University of Barcelona and just a few others have bravely stepped forward and said, no, we're going to train people to be actual journalists and do the work of journalists by training them in universities. And internally, usually the story behind the founding of these programs is very much like the story of the founding of Columbia Journalism School. A lot of dissent behind the scenes. That may happen, Mr. President, about everything that happens at the university, but I know it happens around journalism programs. So when President Bollinger came to Columbia, the idea was to kind of make the journalism school more linked into the university by drawing on university resources more, having more intellectual content in the curriculum, and so on. So all that was going on. It was a big part of my early time at the school. Within a very short time, it became clear, and what should have been clear to us all along, that American journalism was heading into a very dramatic period of crisis, which it's now right in the middle of. So I'll describe that a little bit. And some of this will seem familiar to you because there are similarities in Spain, although the situation here is not exactly the same. So in the United States has always had more or less a high degree of press freedom since it was founded. And, you know, of course, press freedom is written into the national constitution. It's a clause in the First Amendment of the Constitution. But, you know, when the country was founded, what people were thinking when they were thinking about the press, what it meant, what role it played protecting the freedom of the press, they really were not thinking about what I used to do for a living before I was a dean and what you are going off to do as you leave this school, which is being a reporter and finding out what's going on in the world in a sort of active, full-time way and telling the public about it. The press, when the United States was founded, was a strange combination of, I mean, it was a very important part of national life. A lot of it was what we would call opinion journalism. It was people like Thomas Paine, if you've heard that name from American history, people who had very strong political opinions and felt that the way to voice their political opinions would not be to stand on the corner and speak, but instead to go to the print shop and have them printed up and distributed in the form of pamphlets and essays. So that was a great portion of the press and a lot of the freedom that the founders were protecting. Newspapers existed. They tended to be quite similar to a lot of websites you see now run by what we now call aggregators. That is, they had a lot of little snippets. They didn't have staffs. They tended to be one-person operations. They had the problem of how to get content, and they did their version of aggregating and crowdsourcing. They brought in material clipped from papers in Europe and elsewhere and sent in by correspondence, one paragraph at a time. So if you read a newspaper, it has this giant of that time, a lot of mishmash of information and little paragraphs pasted all over the front page. Gradually over time, in the 19th century, the United States developed a reportorial tradition, and this became, and I'm simplifying the story greatly, it wasn't a grand design by any means, but the repertorial tradition grew up, the idea that journalists could be these sort of impertinent people who went to see powerful politicians and other figures and asked them questions that you wouldn't ordinarily ask someone occupying such a grand position, and then would write up the answers, all that stuff. This information gathering job very roughly coincided with the development of newspapers into real businesses, not party organs of partisan politics, not one-person operations like today's blogs, but actual, significant businesses that made owners like Pulitzer a lot of money because they published material that lots and lots of people, particularly in cities, wanted to read. So by the beginning of the 20th century, you had, in most big cities in the United States, many daily newspapers competing wildly for readers. The better, as business people, of the publishers were quite rich. And you were starting to have some kind of professional consciousness among the journalists themselves, a notion of, here are the rules we operate by, here are our ethics, here are our techniques. And it was in that moment that journalism education was founded. Let's skip ahead a lot of years. What happened gradually, I'm compressing the story, was first of all, lots of new media came along. If you look at total circulation of newspapers through the 20th century in the United States, it's a steady trip downward. And it's steady way before the internet was ever invented. And the reason it keeps going downward is there are fewer and fewer papers. So gradually, new media came along, first radio, then television, cable television, alternative weeklies, magazines, finally the internet, probably the most powerful new medium, but only one of a long series of new media to compete to some extent with the newspapers. And the economics worked out such that it went from being a very competitive business in cities to, in most cities, a monopoly business. There would be one big morning newspaper. So when that happened, which is when I was starting out, the feeling was, oh, what a tragedy. All these newspapers have gone out of business, and now there's only one monopoly newspaper in every big city. And the United States didn't, at that time, have national newspapers, but had a sort of archipelago of powerful local metropolitan newspapers. This is the period that we now look back on as the wonderful golden age. Golden ages are always a little bit in the past. What was good about it? What was good about it was that if you were lucky enough to own a newspaper in a big city, and many of these newspapers were family-owned and had been passed down through the generations, for a while there in the 80s and 90s, they were incredibly profitable. They were among the most profitable of sectors in the economy. A typical newspaper would have a natural profitability of 25%, 30%, 35%, even 40%. So very often what happened was, let me stop for a moment. Why were they so profitable? They didn't have any competitors left. They were in a business with a very high barrier to entry. In other words, it's very hard to start a newspaper on newsprint and compete with an existing newspaper because you have to build a big plant and buy printing presses and hire a staff and get delivery trucks. And the delivery technology is very expensive, capital intensive, and complicated.